On August 18, 1590, 3 years. 1 month and 1 day since John White last stood on this shore. The ship's longboat scraped against the sand of Roanoke Island, and White climbed out into a thick Carolina night. He had been trying to get back here for 3 years. 3 years of bureaucratic delays, war fever in England, and storms. White was the governor of this colony. These were his people. One of them, Virginia Dare, was his granddaughter. Born on this island in August of 1587, the first English child born in the Americas, he called out. No one answered. The men with him raised a trumpet and played the old familiar tunes, the songs the colonists would have known. They fired a signal gun. They lit torches and swept them across the tree line. Nothing came back. But the sound of the Atlantic and the rustling of whatever lived in those dark Carolina woods. They found the settlement the next morning. Palisade fence was still standing, which was at least something, but the houses were gone. Every structure the colonists had built had been carefully dismantled. Whatever had happened here, it had not happened in a panic. White found his own belongings, chests he'd left behind, buried and ruined by rain and exposure. His maps were rotted, his books molded. His armor was there, but the iron had turned to rust, and then carved into a post of the palisade, a single word. CROATOAN. Higher up on a nearby tree, the letters CROW. White was not entirely alarmed at first. Before he left, he and the colonists had agreed on a signal system. If they moved, they were to carve their destination. If they left under duress, they were to carve a cross. There was no cross. The word CROATOAN seemed to White like an instruction. Go south. We are there. But the weather turned. A storm gathered. The cables holding the anchor snapped. The captain of White's ship declared it impossible to sail further south to Croatoan Island. They would have to winter in the Caribbean and return in the spring. John White never returned. He died in Ireland sometime around 1606, an old man who spent his last years writing letters, pleading for someone to go find them. No one went. Not officially. Not in time. And so begins one of the most enduring mysteries in American history. Welcome back to Whispered Chronicles, echoes of forgotten lore. In our last journey, we stood in places where people vanished into silence, where the world offered no answers. But here the silence is different, because this time they may not have vanished at all. To understand what happened to the Roanoke colonists, you have to understand why they were there in the first place, and how desperately wrong the enterprise went, almost from the beginning. The man behind the Roanoke colony was Sir Walter Raleigh, one of the great operators of the Elizabethan court. In 1584, Queen Elizabeth granted him a charter to explore and settle the lands of North America, not already claimed by a Christian king, a clause that conveniently overlooked the hundreds of thousands of people already living there. Raleigh never set foot in Roanoke himself. He was too politically valuable in London. But he funded the expeditions. He lobbied for resources. And he gave the coast of North America the name it would carry for over a century: Virginia, in honor of his queen. The first Roanoke expedition in 1585 was purely military. 100 or so soldiers landed on the island, built a fort, spent a winter, burned a neighboring village over a stolen silver cup, and then abandoned the whole enterprise. When Sir Francis Drake stopped by on his way home from raiding Spanish settlements in the Caribbean, Drake offered the soldiers a ride. They took it. When Raleigh sent a follow-up ship a few weeks later, they found the fort empty. They left 15 men behind as a skeleton garrison and sailed back to England. The 1587 expedition was different. This was not a military venture. Raleigh's new plan was a civilian colony, men, women, and children who would actually settle the land. 117 people boarded ships in the spring of 1587. Among them were 17 women, 9 children, and a man named John White, appointed as their governor. White was an artist. His watercolors of the indigenous peoples and landscapes of the Carolina coast are still some of the most extraordinary documents of the early contact period. Precise, observant, genuinely curious, in the way that was rare for Europeans of his era. The plan was not to land at Roanoke Island at all. Raleigh wanted the colony further north, on the Chesapeake Bay, where the harbor was better and relations with local tribes were less fraught. But Simon Fernandez, The Portuguese pilot commanding the lead ship had other ideas. He was behind schedule. He wanted to get back to England before hurricane season. And he dropped the colonists at Roanoke Island in late July and refused to take them further. They were left where the failed military garrison had been, an island with poor soil and a harbor too shallow for large ships. In a region where the English had already managed to make enemies of several of the indigenous nations, they had no choice but to make the best of it. What they found when they landed was grim. The 15 men left behind from the previous expedition were gone. One skeleton was found, picked apart by birds. The fort was overgrown. The houses were standing, but occupied by deer and tangled with weeds. And the Roanoke Algonquian peoples, once cautiously friendly, were now deeply wary. A colonist named George Howe was killed almost immediately, struck by arrows while crabbing alone in the shallows. Despite all this, the colony tried to establish itself. They repaired the houses. They reached out through Monteo, a member of the CROATOAN nation who had traveled to England twice and served as interpreter and guide, to restore diplomatic relations with local tribes. And on August 18, 1587, Eleanor White Dare, the governor's daughter, gave birth to a daughter. They named the baby Virginia Dare, the first English child born in what would become the United States. But the situation was already unraveling. The colonists had arrived too late in the season to plant crops. Their supplies were running short. The hostility of some neighboring tribes made hunting and foraging dangerous. Within a month of landing, the colonists came to their governor with a request he found deeply uncomfortable. John White had to go back to England himself and make the case for resupply. White resisted. He knew how it would look, a governor who abandoned his colony the moment things got hard. He knew the gossip and accusations that would follow him across the Atlantic. But the colonists put it in writing. They signed a document urging him to go, pledging to care for his belongings and promising that they were committed to staying. He left on August 27, 1587. He never saw any of them again. What John White found waiting for him in England was not the urgent rescue mission he needed. It was a world completely consumed by the threat of Spanish invasion. Philip II of Spain had been assembling his great fleet for months. The English knew it was coming. In April 1588, the Queen's Privy Council issued an order that no ships could leave English ports. Every vessel was needed for the defense of the realm. White's resupply mission. His desperate plea to save 117 people on an island in Carolina was caught entirely in the machinery of geopolitics. The Spanish Armada came in July of 1588. Drake's fire ships scattered it in the English Channel. Atlantic storms finished the job. England celebrated a miraculous victory. And then the slow, grinding work of wartime resumed, and John White spent the next 2 years trying to get anyone to give him a ship. He managed a brief attempt in 1588, 2 small pinnaces, undermanned and undersupplied. They were attacked by French pirates in the Bay of Biscay. 1 captain was wounded. They limped back to England. The colony was now going on 2 years without contact. White finally secured passage in 1590, not with a dedicated relief fleet, but as a passenger on a privateering expedition. Ships whose real business was raiding Spanish shipping in the Caribbean. The colonists were an afterthought. The profit motive was the point. When he finally arrived on Roanoke Island on August 18, 1590, exactly 3 years to the day after his granddaughter Virginia Dare was born, he found that single carved word, the rusted armor, the rotted books, and the silence. The colonists had been alone for 3 years. 3 years without resupply, without reinforcement, without any contact with England. What would you do in that situation? You would survive. You would adapt. You would make decisions based on the realities in front of you, not the plan drawn up by a courtier in London. And the realities in front of them were clear. Without help from England, their only options were absorption into the indigenous world around them or death. John White believed they had gone to CROATOAN. He said so in his last written account. Went the evidence building quietly over the past 2 decades of serious archaeological work. Suggests he was right, or at least partly right. For most of the 4 centuries following White's return, the lost colony of Roanoke was treated as an unsolvable mystery. Theories multiplied. They vanished, were killed, absorbed, or swallowed by the wilderness. Proof remained stubbornly absent. That began to change in the early 2000s. Accelerating dramatically in 2012, a researcher at the British Museum, Brent Lane, working with the First Colony Foundation, took a closer look at a map drawn by John White himself, long in the museum's collection. White made this detailed map during the 1585 expedition, rendering the Carolina coast and interior. Scholars noticed a patch on it, a rectangular piece of paper glued over a portion near the Albemarle Sound and Chowan River, far inland from Roanoke Island. In 2012, the British Museum used multispectral imaging, revealing what lay beneath. A small, four-pointed symbol appeared. This mark, consistently used in White's cartography, signified a fort, a hidden fort, deliberately covered on the map. Located 50 miles inland from Roanoke Island, in modern-day Bertie County, North Carolina. Why? White covered it remains unknown. Perhaps for secrecy, hidden from rivals or enemies. But the mark suggested colonists established an interior position, away from the coast, away from the exposed and increasingly dangerous Roanoke Island, seeking a safer haven. The First Colony Foundation launched excavations at Site X. The location sits on a high bluff above Salmon Creek. Near where it meets the Chowan River, a defensible inland position frightened colonists might seek out. Excavations over multiple field seasons since 2012 began to turn up material not belonging to indigenous peoples. They found fragments of European pottery, specifically borderware, utilitarian buff-colored pottery from Surrey, England, commonly used in the late 16th century. They also found copper fragments, indicating trade goods, and remnants of a structure with post molds, dark stains in soil where wooden posts once stood, consistent with English construction methods of the period. Crucially, artifacts were found with indigenous material culture. European pottery shards intermixed with indigenous ceramics. This is not a settlement near indigenous people. This is the signature of people living together, a profound new insight into the lost colony of Roanoke. Blue pottery shards at Site X, a tin-glazed earthenware, common in 16th century England, were found. Their presence in Bertie County, 50 miles inland, is significant. This assemblage of artifacts, including borderware and copper, precisely matches the Roanoke colonists' period and origin. Meanwhile, inquiry focused on CROATOAN Island, now Hatteras. The CROATOAN, led by Montejo, maintained cautious goodwill with the English. They were the most likely indigenous group to shelter desperate settlers. Archaeologists on Hatteras Island recovered European artifacts from the late 16th century. These included a signet ring, copper, and English-style materials. This evidence points to sustained contact and exchange. Together, these sites suggest the colony dispersed, not vanished. Some went south to CROATOAN, seeking friendly indigenous communities. Others moved inland to a hidden fort, seeking distance from the coast. They sought the interior Raleigh envisioned. Over 3 years, the colonists split, adapted, and intermarried. Their English identities slowly dissolved into the surrounding indigenous communities, ensuring their survival. Here is what we know about Montejo, because Montejo matters enormously in understanding what likely happened. Montejo was a member of the CROATOAN nation, probably of significant standing within his community. In 1584, he and another man named Wanchese agreed to travel to England with the first Roanoke explorers. He spent time in London, learned English, returned to Roanoke with the 1585 expedition as an interpreter and cultural mediator. Wanchese had a different response to England, came back deeply hostile to the English project, and warned his own people against it. Montejo remained friendly, sailed to England again, and returned with the 1587 civilian colony. When the colonists arrived, Raleigh ordered that Montejo be baptized as a Christian and invested with the title Lord of Roanoke and Dassamongwopunk. This was a nakedly political move, an attempt to establish a proxy authority over indigenous territory through an indigenous man. Whether Montejo experienced this as honor or burden is something we will never know. What we do know is that he was there, on Roanoke Island, in the summer of 1587, and that his people, the CROATOAN, are the ones whose name was carved on that post. If the colonists integrated into CROATOAN society, they were integrating into a world that Montejo understood from both sides. He could have smoothed that passage. He could have vouched for them. The CROATOAN word carved by the colonists was not a cry for help. It was a destination. We went there. Go look. Historical accounts from the early 17th century add further texture. When English explorers from the Jamestown settlement, founded in 1607, asked indigenous nations about survivors of the Roanoke colony, they received answers. Chief Powhatan reportedly told the Jamestown settlers that he had destroyed a group of people living with a neighboring nation, people who had been there since the time before Jamestown. Some accounts suggest Powhatan saw potential rivals everywhere. He may have ordered the killing of a group that included Roanoke survivors living with the Chesapeake people. This would suggest that at least some of the colonists had traveled north from CROATOAN and integrated with the Chesapeake Nation. John Smith, the Jamestown captain, who recorded some of these accounts, wrote that he received reports of houses built with stone walls and a people who could make European goods. But these are second-hand accounts, filtered through interpreters, recorded by men with their own agendas. They are data, but they are imprecise data. What they add to the archaeological evidence is a picture of people in motion, colonists who spent years moving through the indigenous world, finding shelter where they could, losing their Englishness gradually, becoming something new, not vanished, transformed. The forensic evidence challenges the romantic image of a colony that simply disappeared. The Roanoke colonists didn't just vanish, they made deliberate decisions, walking to specific places they already knew. Yet this forensic picture remains incomplete. Excavations at Site X reveal pottery and copper consistent with the colonists, but no definitive proof of their exact destination. Hatteras Island artifacts are suggestive, though European goods could have arrived through trade, not direct settlement. The deeper questions of their fate remain open. Archaeology suggests a likely trajectory. Lost colony framing is probably wrong. They didn't vanish, but survived by integrating into Croatoan communities, raising children who spoke Algonquian and adapting to the land. We don't know their names after this transformation, nor the stories told by the Croatoan. John White, their governor, spent his life wondering. In his final letters, he surrendered hope, not to certainty, but to silence, a heartbreaking end to an enduring mystery. Roanoke endures in the American imagination because it is, at its root, a story about what it means to be abandoned, about what happens when the structures of civilization recede and leave people alone with the reality of the world as it actually is. The colonists who arrived on that island in 1587 came with an English plan. They would build houses, plant gardens, trade with the natives, send their governor home for supplies, and receive those supplies in an orderly and timely fashion. Within months, every element of that plan had collapsed. The supply ship did not come. The friendly relationships with indigenous people frayed under the weight of English mistrust and violence. The soil of Roanoke Island was poor for farming. The harbor was shallow, the fort was inadequate, and so they adapted. They did what humans have always done when the plan fails. They looked around them, identified who was surviving and how, and made the pragmatic choice. Croatoan, go south. These people know this land. Join them. The great irony of the lost colony is that the colonists probably succeeded in the only way available to them, by abandoning the colonial project and becoming something it had never intended to create. Not English settlers on American soil, but people who belonged to this land in a new way, married into its nations, speaking its languages, carrying their English names and their English memories into communities that would, over generations, absorb and transform and ultimately forget them. Croatoan. The word stands at the beginning of American history, like a carved stone at a crossroads. It tells us where they went, but it does not tell us what they found when they got there, or who they became, or whether they considered themselves lost at all. The archaeology is still being done. New excavations at Site 10 and on Hatteras Island continue to refine the picture. Technology like ground-penetrating radar and LiDAR, which uses aerial laser pulses to reveal buried structures through vegetation, is being applied to the landscape of coastal and inland North Carolina in ways that would have been impossible even 20 years ago. The picture is becoming clearer. Maybe we will one day find a 16th century grave with English objects and Croatoan burial rites. Maybe we will find the remnant of that inland fort under a field in Bertie County. Maybe the answer has been in the soil all along, waiting for the right question. Until then, we are left with John White's word, a name carved in wood on a cold August night, without a cross above it, without distress. Just a place, just a direction. It's the ordinary courage of people who looked at the world as it was, not as they had been told it would be, and decided to keep going. That single word, CROATOAN, not an ending. A beginning we have yet to fully read. The story of Roanoke doesn't end in disappearance. It ends in transformation. A group of people who arrived with a plan and survived by letting it go. By stepping out of the world they came from and into one they had never intended to join. It was meant to guide someone who never came. CROATOAN, not a mystery, but a direction. And maybe that's why it still lingers, because it reminds us that not every ending is a disappearance. Some are simply stories that continued, somewhere we didn't follow. Thank you for walking through this with me, and for spending your time here with Whispered Chronicles. It's echoes of forgotten lore. If you find yourself drawn to stories like this, the ones that live in the spaces between what we know and what we assume, consider subscribing and stay close. There are more echoes waiting. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe.